I still remember the moment everything started to break open inside me. I said, Daniel, you need to explain what is happening. He looked at me and said, you were never supposed to see me like this. I whispered, like what? A stranger? He replied, like this version of me. A woman stepped forward and said, Emily Carter, right? I turned and said, yes, and you are? She answered, Grace Reed. I said, what is your connection to him? Daniel said, she saved me. I said, saved you from what? Grace said, from dying in the streets you found him in. I felt my chest tighten and said, that night, you disappeared after that. Daniel nodded and said, because I was taken. I said, taken by who? He replied, by people who saw potential in pain. Grace said, we rebuilt him. I said, rebuilt? He was a human, not a project. Daniel said, I was nothing before her. I said, you were someone to me. He looked away and said, that was the old me. I stepped back and said, then why bring me here? Daniel said, because you deserve the truth. I laughed softly and said, truth? After years? Grace said, you are connected to this more than you know. I said, stop talking in riddles. She said, Victor Hale. I froze and said, what about him? Daniel said, his company destroyed my family. I whispered, that can't be true. Grace said, it is very true. I said, Victor is not like that. Daniel replied, every empire has a cost. I said, he built stability, not destruction. Grace said, stability built on ruins. I felt my voice shake and said, you're lying. Daniel stepped closer and said, I wish I was. I said, why are you telling me this now? He said, because you're about to marry into it. I whispered, no. Grace said, we did not choose this timing. I said, you expect me to believe this? Daniel said, I don't expect anything anymore. I said, then why bring me here? He said, because I couldn't let you marry blind. I felt my heart pounding and said, Victor would never hurt people. Grace said, he already did. I said, proof? Daniel handed me a file and said, read it. I hesitated and said, what is this? He said, everything you refuse to see. I opened it and whispered, oh my God. Grace said, now you understand. I said, no, I don't. Daniel said, Emily, your life is tied to his empire. I said, stop. I need time. Grace said, time won't undo truth. I said, why me? Daniel said, because you were the only good thing in my past. I said, then why destroy it? He said, because it was already destroyed before I returned. I stood silently and said, so what now? Grace said, now you decide. Daniel said, stay with him or walk away from everything. I whispered, I can't breathe. He said softly, you finally understand why I changed. I said, you didn't change. You became someone else. He replied, the world made me this. I looked at him and said, and what am I supposed to do with this truth? Grace said, live with it. Daniel said, or fight it. I stepped back and said, I don't know you anymore. He said, maybe you never knew the real me. I shook my head and said, I loved who I thought you were. Silence fell. Then I said, Victor, he can't be part of this. Daniel said, he is the center of it. I whispered, everything is falling apart. Grace said, we're finally coming together. I turned away and said, I need to think. Daniel said, Emily, don't go back to ignorance. I said, I don't know where I belong anymore. Daniel said, you belong to the truth. I said, the truth is destroying everything. He said, it was already destroyed, you just didn't see it. Grace said, Emily, you have a choice. I said, it doesn't feel like a choice. Daniel said, it always is. I looked at him and said, why did you wait so long? He said, because I needed to become strong enough to face him. I said, Victor? He nodded and said, yes. Grace said, and you were part of that path. I said, don't put me in this. He said, you already are in it. I said, I came here for answers, not a war. Grace said, sometimes they are the same thing. Daniel said, I never wanted you hurt. I said, then why does it feel like I'm already losing everything? He said, because you are standing between two worlds. I said, I can't handle this. Grace said, you have to. Daniel said, I came back for you. I said, that doesn't fix anything. He said, it changes everything. I shook my head and said, I need air. Grace said, think carefully, Emily. Daniel said, don't run from this. I said, I'm not running. I'm surviving. He said, then survive the truth. I said, I will decide later. Grace said, later might be too late. Daniel said, I will wait. I said, don't wait for me. He said, I already have. I turned away and said, this isn't my life anymore. Grace said, it always was. Daniel said, Emily, remember who you are. I stopped. Daniel said, it's starting. I looked at him and said, what is starting? He replied, his empire is cracking. I said, you're talking about Victor. He nodded and said, I'm talking about everything he built on lies. I shook my head and said, you don't even know what you're doing. He said calmly, I know exactly what I'm doing. I whispered, you're destroying my life. He replied, I'm exposing the truth. I said, those are not the same thing. He looked at me and said, they are when the foundation is blood. I stepped back and said, stop talking like this. He said, you always knew something was off. I said, I trusted him. He replied, that was your mistake, not your crime. My phone rang immediately after. Victor's name flashed. I said, I have to take this. Daniel said, you don't have to answer him. I said, I do. I picked up and said, Victor? His voice was sharp. Where are you? I said, I'm at work. He said, don't lie to me, Emily. I froze. He continued, I know you've been meeting him. I whispered, that's not. He cut me off. Don't insult me. I said, Victor, calm down. He said, you're choosing him over everything I gave you. I said, this isn't about choosing. He replied, it is now. Then he hung up. I stood there shaking. Daniel said softly, he's losing control. I said, he's just stressed. Daniel replied, no, he's afraid. I said, afraid of what? Daniel looked at me and said, of me. I turned away and said, this is insane. He said, then prove it. I said, prove what? He handed me another file. More records. I said, I don't want your files. He said, you need them more than you need comfort. I opened it anyway. My voice dropped. These are companies, contracts, Daniel said, and victims. I said, this can't be real. He replied, it already happened. I said, Victor built hospitals, schools. Daniel interrupted, and destroyed the people who couldn't pay for them. I stepped back and said, stop. He said, you're looking at the part you want to believe. I said, you're twisting everything. He said, I'm showing you what I lived. My phone rang again. Victor. I didn't answer. Sophie texted immediately. Emily, please be careful. Something is happening. I whispered, everyone is warning me now. Daniel said, it's collapsing faster than I expected. I said, you expected this? He replied, I prepared for it. I said, so this is revenge. He looked at me and said, it started as survival. I felt my chest tighten. I said, and now? He said, now it's truth. I whispered, you become someone I don't recognize. He said, I became what I needed to become. I walked away and said, Victor will fix this. Daniel said behind me, he can't fix what he built on ruin. I turned and said, you're wrong. He stepped closer and said, then stay and watch him save himself. That night, Victor came to my apartment without warning. He said, we need to talk. I said, "You can't just show up like this." He said, "You've been disappearing from my life." I replied, "I've been working." He laughed coldly. "With him?" I said, "Stop." He stepped inside and said, "Tell me the truth." I said, "About what?" He said, "About Daniel Reed." My silence gave me away. He nodded slowly. "So it's true," I said. "Victor, please." He raised his voice. "Don't defend him in my house." I said, "This isn't your house alone." He stared at me and said, "You've changed." I said, "Maybe I'm just waking up." His expression hardened. "Waking up to what?" I said, "To things I should have seen earlier." He said, "You're being manipulated." I replied, "By who? You or him?" The room went silent. He said quietly, "I gave you everything." I said, "And I gave you trust." He said, "Trust? You're destroying our future." I said, "Our future was never built on truth." He stepped closer and said, "If you walk away now, you lose everything." I said, "Maybe I already lost it." His voice lowered. "You don't mean that." I looked at him and said, "I think I do." He grabbed my wrist slightly. "You're not thinking clearly." I pulled away and said, "Don't touch me." He froze. "You're choosing him." I said, "I'm choosing truth." His face changed. "You'll regret this." I said, "I already regret ignoring it." He said sharply, "After everything I built for you?" I replied, "You built it on things I didn't know." He stepped back, breathing heavily. "So this is it?" I said, "I don't know what this is anymore." He looked at me and said, "Then you've already lost." After he left, I sat on the floor. My phone kept ringing, but I didn't answer. Sophie called too. I whispered, "I can't go back." Daniel texted only one line, "It's falling now." I closed my eyes and said, "What have I done?" Then I opened them and corrected myself. No, what had to be done? I stood up and said out loud, "I choose truth." But my voice shook. Because choosing truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like stepping off something I could never climb back onto again. And as the city outside lit up in silence, I realized everything I built with Victor was already collapsing, and I was standing at the center of it. I walked into the room and said, "Everything is here." My voice shook, but I kept going. Records, contracts, evidence, everything Victor tried to bury. The officers looked at me and said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I said, "I'm already past the point of turning back." Victor stood across the room. He said quietly, "Emily, stop this." I looked at him and said, "You stopped it a long time ago." He stepped forward and said, "You don't understand what you're doing." I replied, "For the first time, I think I do." Daniel stood beside me, silent. I said, "Say something." He replied, "There's nothing left to say." Victor turned toward him and said, "This is your revenge?" Daniel said coldly, "No, this is correction." I said, "Victor, did you deny all of it?" He said, "Everything I did was to build something stable." I said, "At what cost?" He said, "You think I had choices?" I replied, "Everyone has choices." An officer stepped forward and said, "Mr. Hale, you are under arrest." The room shifted instantly. Victor turned to me and said, "You did this." I said, "No, you did this." He said, "After everything I gave you?" I said, "You gave me a lie." He looked at me for a long moment and said softly, "You'll regret this when he leaves you too." I flinched but didn't answer. Daniel stepped forward slightly and said, "Don't speak about her like that." Victor laughed bitterly. "You think he's different?" I said, "Enough." The officers moved him toward the door. He looked back and said, "You destroyed everything we had." I said quietly, "There was nothing real to destroy." The door closed. The sound felt final. Silence filled the room. I turned to Daniel and said, "It's over." He nodded slowly and said, For him. I said, "What does that mean?" He replied, "My part is done." I stepped closer and said, "Daniel, wait." He looked at me and said, "I already waited too long." I said, "We can fix this." He shook his head and said, "Some things aren't meant to be fixed." I whispered, "So this is goodbye?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "This was goodbye a long time ago." I felt my chest tighten. "Don't do this," he said. "I'm not running. I'm leaving it behind." I said, "After everything, you're just walking away?" He replied, "I never came back to stay." I shook my head and said, "Then why save me from him?" He looked at me and said, "Because you didn't deserve to be blind." I stepped forward and said, "Daniel, please." He held up a hand gently and said, "Don't." I stopped. He said softly, "Revenge took too much from me already. I don't want it to take more." I whispered, "So I was part of revenge too?" He said, "No, you were the only thing that made me hesitate. That hit harder than anything else." I said, "Then stay." He replied, "If I stay, I'll become what I hate again." I said, "And if you leave?" He said, "Then I finally stop." The room felt like it was shrinking. I said, "I don't know how to let you go." He looked at me and said, "You already started when you chose truth." I said, "I didn't choose against you." He said, "I know." For the first time, his expression softened completely. He said, "Emily, you saved me once." I whispered, "I tried." He nodded, "And I became what I needed to become." I said, "Was it worth it?" He looked away and said, "I don't know yet." Then he looked back at me and added, "But meeting you was the only real thing in it." My eyes filled, but I didn't speak. He stepped back and said, "Take care of yourself." I said, "Don't leave like this." He replied, "There's no other way left for me." He turned toward the door. I said one last time, "Daniel?" He stopped, but didn't turn fully. I said, "Am I just something you're walking away from?" He answered quietly, "You're the reason I can." And then he left. I stood there long after the room emptied. The silence felt heavier than everything that came before it. An officer asked softly, "Are you all right?" I said, "I don't know what I am anymore." I walked outside and saw the city like it had changed shape. Sophie was waiting at the edge. She said, "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded. She said, "And you?" I said, "I don't feel like I won anything." She said, "You did the right thing." I whispered, "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" She didn't answer. I looked at the sky and said quietly, "I saved a boy once." Sophie asked, "And now?" I said, "Now I understand what he became, and what I became because of it." I closed my eyes and said, "Justice isn't clean." Sophie said, "But it's done." I nodded slowly. As I walked away, I realized something I couldn't escape. I didn't just expose Victor. I didn't just lose Daniel. I had lived through the consequences of every choice I thought was right. And for the first time, I understood some endings don't feel like victory. They feel like becoming someone new you never asked to be. I still remember the day I started my company. I had nothing except a small rented room, a broken laptop, and a dream that everyone laughed at. People told me I would fail, but I worked day and night. I barely slept, barely ate, and slowly, my small idea started growing. I hired my first employee, a young developer named Daniel Ross, who believed in me when no one else did. Together, we built something real. "Are you really serious about building this, or are we just dreaming?" Daniel asked me that first night. I laughed while staring at the glowing screen. If I wasn't serious, I wouldn't be sitting here fixing code at 3 a.m. He nodded and said, "Then I'm with you." Those words meant everything to me. Months later, investors began appearing out of nowhere. Victor Hale walked into my office like he already owned it. "I've been watching your progress," he said. "Impressive." "Thank you." I replied carefully. But we're just getting started. He leaned forward. I like founders like you. Driven. Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I forced a calm voice. I hope so. Later that night, I told Ethan Blake, my best friend and business partner, I don't trust that Victor guy. Ethan smiled. Relax. He's an investor. We need him. Are you sure? I asked. Completely sure. That was the moment I ignored my instinct. Our company grew faster than I ever imagined. Users doubled, servers expanded, and Daniel once said, "This is getting bigger than we thought." I smiled. That's the point. We're changing everything. Ethan kept reassuring me. Finances are clean. Trust me. I didn't question him anymore. Victor visited often after that, always with expensive gifts and smoother promises. You're going to change the industry, he said once. I should have asked why his confidence felt so sharp, but I just nodded. Looking back, Ethan once warned me, big success always has hidden risks. I laughed. Not this time. But late one night, Ethan called me urgently. We need to talk privately. When I arrived, half the building was dark. Daniel stood near my desk, tense. I think something is wrong with the accounts, he said. That can't be right, I snapped. He slid a file toward me. Check it yourself. My hand shook. Ethan handled this, didn't he? Daniel looked away. At that moment, my world shifted. Tell me the truth, Daniel. I can't. Not here. Footsteps came down the hallway. The door opened. Ethan walked in, smiling. Why do you all look so serious? What's going on, Ethan? I demanded. Relax, he said smoothly. Everything is fine. But Daniel stayed silent, and that silence broke something inside me. I want the truth right now. You're overreacting, Ethan said. Daniel finally spoke. He moved the funds last week. My chest tightened. You lied to me. Ethan's smile faded. It's not what it looks like. Everything I built started collapsing in my mind. How long have you been planning this? I whispered. He didn't answer. Daniel said quietly, I'm sorry, I couldn't stop it. I took a deep breath. This isn't over. It already is, Ethan replied. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked Daniel. I was scared. The room felt colder than ever. Get out of my company, Ethan. He didn't move. Daniel whispered, I'm still with you. I nodded slowly, knowing everything had changed. I stood there in silence, realizing the company I built from nothing was now slipping out of my control, and I could feel the weight of every late night, every sacrifice, and every promise I made to myself coming back all at once as I looked at Ethan and Daniel, knowing nothing would ever be the same again, and I finally understood betrayal had been growing right under my trust all along. I thought success would make everything easier, but I was wrong from the very first week. My company grew faster than I could control. Meetings never stopped, and new employees kept joining every day. I remember telling Ethan, we are losing control. He just smiled and said, this is what growth looks like. I didn't agree, but I stayed silent because I trusted him like a brother. That was when I hired Mia Carter as my assistant. She walked into my office and said, you look like you've not slept in days. I replied, sleep is a luxury I can't afford right now. Mia nodded and said, then I will make sure everything else runs smoothly. She started organizing schedules, fixing reports, and handling calls without slowing down. One night, Ethan walked into my office and said, we made changes without your approval. What? I asked, standing up immediately. It was for efficiency, Ethan said, not meeting your schedule. I frowned and said, you can't make decisions without me. He replied, if we waited for you, we would fall behind. Still, I trusted him and let it go, even though it bothered me. Later, I met Claire Morgan at a business event. She looked at me and said, "You are being watched closely." "By who?" I asked, surprised. She replied, "Investors don't trust uncontrolled founders." I laughed and said, "I'm doing fine." She leaned closer and said, "Read your contracts carefully, especially the hidden clauses." I didn't take her seriously at that time. Meanwhile, Victor Hale kept visiting, always with expensive offers and heavier demands. Victor said, "Your company needs stronger leadership." I replied, "I am not giving control away." He smiled and said, "Then you will struggle to scale." I felt pressure building, but I stayed firm. Ethan later said, "Just sign the agreement. We need funding fast." I asked, "Did you read it properly?" He said, "Don't worry. I handled everything." I nodded, trusting him again, despite a small voice inside me warning otherwise. Claire called me the next day and said, "We need to talk urgently." I asked, "What is it?" She said, "Your investor contracts are dangerous." I frowned and said, "Explain more." She replied, "There are clauses giving away control rights." I said, "That can't be true." She answered, "Read them again." I didn't want to believe it, but her tone scared me. That night, I opened the documents myself. Ethan walked in and said, "Still working?" I said, "Did you change something here?" He replied, "Everything is standard." I stared at him, unsure whether to trust him anymore. Victor called me later and said, "We need more control to protect your company." I said, "This is too much." He said, "Trust me, it is necessary." I felt trapped between everyone I trusted. Mia came into my office and said, "Your schedule is completely overloaded." I said, "Just keep it running." She replied, "You are burning out." I said, "I don't have time to slow down." Ethan told me, "We are signing new deals tonight." I asked, "Why without me?" He said, "You were busy." I started realizing something was off, but I ignored it. Claire warned me again and said, "They are isolating you." I said, "That sounds paranoid." She replied, "It is strategy." I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about everything. Victor sent a message, "Final approval needed tomorrow." I replied, "I will review it." Ethan said, "Don't delay." I felt pressure from every side. Mia said, "Investors are asking questions." I said, "Let me handle it." Claire said, "You are running out of time." I felt my world tightening. Ethan said, "We need to finalize everything now." I asked, "What are you hiding?" He said, "Nothing important." I didn't believe him. Victor said, "Sign today or lose the deal." I said, "Give me time." He said, "There is no time." I felt cornered. Mia whispered, "Something is wrong here." I said, "I know." Claire said, "Then act before it is too late." I stood in silence. Ethan said, "What are you deciding?" I said, "I need truth." He said, "Truth will cost you everything." I didn't respond. Victor said, "Last chance." I said, "I refuse." He said, "Then you are finished." I felt everything collapse inside me. Mia said, "I am with you." I said, "Thank you." Claire said, "Now fight back." I took a deep breath. I said, "I will not lose my company." Ethan said, "You already have." I stared at him. Victor said, "Choose now." I said, "I choose myself." I felt everything shift inside me. Mia said, "Then we rebuild together." Claire nodded and said, "Start now." I looked at everything I had built. I said, "No more lies." Ethan said, "You will regret this." I replied, Not anymore. Mia said, we can fix this. Claire said, stay focused. I felt something inside me wake up. I stood there and said, this ends now. I will not let anyone control my life again. I looked at them and felt everything finally make sense. No more lies, no more control, no more fear. I was done being used by people I trusted, and I knew I would rebuild everything from the ground up. Starting now, I take my company back for good, finally. I still remember the day I started my company. I had nothing except a small rented room, a broken laptop, and a dream that everyone laughed at. People told me I would fail, but I worked day and night. I barely slept, barely ate. Ethan walked into my office holding a contract and said, this is just a routine expansion agreement. Victor is offering a massive investment, he added. I didn't read it carefully. I trusted him, so I signed it without thinking. That single signature changed my entire life. 2 days later, I got a legal notice. My stomach dropped as I read it. I had unknowingly signed over controlling shares of my company. I called Ethan immediately. His voice was calm, almost cold. He said, don't worry, it's temporary. It's just structure, he added. But something felt wrong. I hung up and sat there staring at the screen. Claire rushed into my office after I sent her the documents. Her face turned pale. She said, you didn't just sign an investment deal. You gave away control, she said. My hands started shaking. For the first time in 15 years, I realized I might lose everything. I stood up so fast my chair nearly fell. I called Ethan again. He answered immediately. I said, Ethan, what did you make me sign? He replied, relax. It's standard investor protection. I said, this is not standard. I gave up control. He paused before speaking. You're overreacting, he said. My chest tightened as I heard his tone. I whispered, you knew, didn't you? He didn't answer. I ended the call and felt my hands go cold. I immediately messaged Claire. She replied, I'm coming to your office now. I waited in silence, pacing the room. My thoughts kept repeating one thing. I just lost control of my company. Claire arrived 10 minutes later and walked straight into my office. She said, show me everything. I handed her the contract with shaking hands. She started reading silently. Then she looked up at me. This is worse than I thought. I asked, tell me the truth, Claire. She said, you didn't just sign a contract. You transferred controlling ownership rights. I felt my knees weaken. I said, that's impossible. She replied, it's legally binding. I stepped back from my desk. I said, Ethan told me it was routine. Claire shook her head. He lied to you, she said. Everything inside me felt like it was collapsing. I whispered, I trusted him. Claire said, that's the problem. I asked, what do I do now? She replied, you fight. I said, fight against who? Claire said, everyone who signed you into this. I felt my phone vibrate again. It was Victor. I answered reluctantly. He said, we need to meet. I said, you already took control from me. He replied, it's business. I said, you lied to me. Claire whispered, don't trust him. I said into the phone, what do you want now? He said, everything is already signed. My heart dropped again. I looked at Claire in panic. She said, this is the trap I warned you about. I whispered, I didn't see it coming. Claire said, most people don't. I said, so I've lost everything? She replied, not yet. I took a shaky breath. I said, then help me fix this. Claire said, we start tonight. I nodded slowly. I said, Ethan did this to me. Claire said, and he's not done yet. I felt anger rising inside me. I said, I trusted him like family. Claire replied, That's how betrayal works. I said, I want him gone. She said, we will do it legally. I looked at my empty office. I said, everything I built is slipping away. Claire said, not if you fight back. I whispered, I won't lose again. Claire said, then stand up. I stood slowly, feeling something change inside me. I said, this is just the beginning. Claire said, good. Now we plan. I looked at the contract one last time. I said, I will take my company back. Claire said, and we start with Ethan. I said, he won't see this coming. Claire replied, he already thinks he won. I clenched my fists. I said, not anymore. Claire said, we expose everything. I said, and Victor? Claire said, he is the real power behind it. I felt my fear turn into focus. I said, then I go after both. Claire said, now you're thinking like a CEO. I looked at the broken trust around me. I said, I won't let them take everything. Claire said, then you won't lose. I took a deep breath and said, we begin now. I sat back down, feeling my life shift in a way I couldn't undo. Claire said, every war starts with realization. I said, then I finally understand mine. I looked at Claire and said, from this moment, I stop trusting blindly. I start rebuilding everything carefully, and I make sure Ethan and Victor both regret ever thinking I would stay silent while my company was taken from me piece by piece. I knew this was the start of my fight to reclaim everything I built from scratch again. The emergency board meeting was called early the next morning. I arrived expecting confusion, maybe even panic, but nothing prepared me for what I saw when I pushed the door open. Victor Hale was sitting at the head of the table like he owned the room. Ethan stood right beside him, calm, composed, almost comfortable. My own employees avoided my eyes like I had already disappeared. Victor smiled the moment he saw me. Relax, he said. This is just a transition of leadership. I froze for a second, then forced my voice out. What is this? Ethan didn't look guilty. He looked ready, like he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. He said, you built this company, but I made sure it survives. I stared at him. What are you talking about, Ethan? He replied, you were losing control. Investors needed stability. I felt my chest tighten. So you decided this without me? Victor leaned back in his chair and said, it's already decided. I turned toward the board members. You're all agreeing to this? No one answered me. Claire suddenly stood up from her seat. This is illegal, she said firmly. He was misled into signing clauses he didn't understand. She dropped a folder on the table. Here is proof. Victor didn't even flinch. He nodded slightly, and one of his lawyers stood up immediately. The lawyer said, all agreements were signed under full legal disclosure. Claire snapped, he was manipulated. The lawyer replied, we have documentation proving informed consent. I looked around the table, feeling the room closing in on me. So that's it? You're just taking my company? Victor smiled again. We are restructuring it. Ethan finally looked at me directly. This is for the best. I shook my head. You're lying to yourself if you believe that. He said quietly, I'm protecting what you built. I stepped forward. By stealing it from me? Security shifted near the door. I noticed it too late. Claire said, they've planned this perfectly. I whispered, I can't believe this is happening. Victor tapped the table lightly. Let's conclude this. The head of the board cleared his throat and said, based on majority vote and contractual authority, leadership will transition effective immediately. I felt like the air disappeared from the room. I said, no, this is my company. No one responded. Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time, but he didn't stop it. Claire turned to me and said, they've already locked you out. I whispered, there has to be a way to stop this. Victor stood up slowly. It's already over. The vote was recorded. Papers were signed. The decision was final. I watched everything I built get stripped away in silence. Security stepped closer to me. One of them said, "Sir, you need to leave." I didn't move at first. "I built this for nothing," I said. Ethan spoke softly behind me, "And you're too emotional to protect it now." I turned slowly toward him. "What did you just say?" He didn't hesitate. "You heard me." That sentence hit harder than anything else in the room. Claire grabbed my arm. "We need to go." I pulled my arm back, but didn't argue. Victor said, "We appreciate your contribution." I laughed once, bitterly. My contribution? No one answered. I looked at Ethan one last time. Was any of it real? He didn't reply. That silence told me everything. I walked toward the door, feeling every step heavier than the last. Employees kept their heads down as I passed them, like I had already been erased. Claire followed beside me and whispered, "This isn't the end." I said nothing at first. Then I finally spoke. "It feels like the end." We reached the hallway, and the doors closed behind us with a sound that felt final. Claire said, "They used the system against you." I stopped walking. "No," I said quietly. "They used someone I trusted." She didn't respond. I looked back at the closed boardroom door one last time. Ethan's words replayed in my head again and again, too emotional to run something this big. That was the moment something inside me shut off completely. I said, "I'm done trusting people blindly." Claire said, "Good. Now we fight properly." I nodded slowly. Not as CEO. I paused. As someone they just made their worst enemy. And for the first time since I built my company, I wasn't afraid anymore. The emergency board meeting was called early the next morning. I arrived expecting confusion, maybe even panic, but nothing prepared me for what I saw when I pushed the door open. Victor Hale was sitting at the head of the table, like he owned the room. Ethan stood right beside him, calm, composed, almost comfortable. My own employees avoided my eyes like I had already disappeared. Victor smiled the moment he saw me. "Relax," he said. "This is just a transition of leadership." I froze for a second, then forced my voice out. "What is this?" Ethan didn't look guilty. He looked ready, like he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. He said, "You built this company, but I made sure it survives." I stared at him. "What are you talking about, Ethan?" He replied, "You were losing control. Investors needed stability." I felt my chest tighten. "So you decided this without me?" Victor leaned back in his chair and said, "It's already decided." I turned toward the board members. "You're all agreeing to this?" No one answered me. Claire suddenly stood up from her seat. "This is illegal," she said firmly. "He was misled into signing clauses he didn't understand." She dropped a folder on the table. "Here is proof." Victor didn't even flinch. He nodded slightly, and one of his lawyers stood up immediately. The lawyer said, "All agreements were signed under full legal disclosure." Claire snapped. "He was manipulated." The lawyer replied, "We have documentation proving informed consent." I looked around the table, feeling the room closing in on me. "So, that's it? You're just taking my company?" Victor smiled again. "We are restructuring it." Ethan finally looked at me directly. "This is for the best." I shook my head. "You're lying to yourself if you believe that." He said quietly, "I'm protecting what you built." I stepped forward. "By stealing it from me?" Security shifted near the door. I noticed it too late. Claire said, "They've planned this perfectly." I whispered, "I can't believe this is happening." Victor tapped the table lightly. "Let's conclude this." The head of the board cleared his throat and said, "Based on majority vote and contractual authority, leadership will transition effective immediately." I felt like the air disappeared from the room. I said, "No, This is my company. No one responded. Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time, but he didn't stop it. Claire turned to me and said, "They've already locked you out." I whispered, "There has to be a way to stop this." Victor stood up slowly. "It's already over." The vote was recorded. Papers were signed. The decision was final. I watched everything I built get stripped away in silence. Security stepped closer to me. One of them said, "Sir, you need to leave." I didn't move at first. "I built this from nothing," I said. Ethan spoke softly behind me. "And you're too emotional to protect it now." I turned slowly toward him. "What did you just say?" He didn't hesitate. "You heard me." That sentence hit harder than anything else in the room. Claire grabbed my arm. "We need to go." I pulled my arm back, but didn't argue. Victor said, "We appreciate your contribution." I laughed once, bitterly. My contribution? No one answered. I looked at Ethan one last time. Was any of it real? He didn't reply. That silence told me everything. I walked toward the door, feeling every step heavier than the last. Employees kept their heads down as I passed them, like I had already been erased. Claire followed beside me and whispered, "This isn't the end." I said nothing at first. Then I finally spoke. "It feels like the end." We reached the hallway, and the doors closed behind us with a sound that felt final. Claire said, "They used the system against you." I stopped walking. "No," I said quietly. "They used someone I trusted." She didn't respond. I looked back at the closed boardroom door one last time. Ethan's words replayed in my head again and again, too emotional to run something this big. That was the moment something inside me shut off completely. I said, "I'm done trusting people blindly." Claire said, "Good. Now we fight properly." I nodded slowly. "Not as CEO." I paused. "As someone they just made their worst enemy." And for the first time since I built my company, I wasn't afraid anymore.